Good morning, everyone. My name is Federico Vasoli. I am the CEO of the Antevorta Foundation based in Singapore. I thank you all for joining yet another webinar of our foundation on Good Friday. So we apologize for those of you that are celebrating this important religious festivity or that are on holiday. Regardless, I thank very much our speakers, Professor Francesco Moscone, who has been with us multiple times, and Professor Robin Jarvis from Brunel University of London. Today's webinar is called Rethinking Growth, the Genesis Manifesto in Action for Micro, Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. The Genesis Initiative, the Genesis Manifesto of 2024, focuses on productivity because efficient enhancement of productivity grows the gap between costs of production and return on sales, which is the profit margin. Today's speakers, as already mentioned, are Professor Robin Jarvis from Brunel University of London and Professor Francesco Moscone, who will be the moderator from Brunel University of London and Foscari University of Venice. This webinar is yet again a joint initiative between Brunel University of London, Antevorta Foundation, Foscari University of Venice, and is sponsored by the Italian Ministry of Education with grant number P2022BNNEY. Housekeeping, we are going to record this webinar, and the attendees list may show your names. So if you are uncomfortable with your names being recorded and the very fact that this webinar is going to be recorded, we have to kindly ask you to leave now. Without further ado, let's start. We have 1 hour sharp for this webinar, as always. And we're going to discuss some very topical...
I think there's a little problem with the connection, with your connection, perhaps.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Francesco. Let me... Hello? Francesco, you're further. Professor Jarvis, I can see you. You can hear me, right?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
So, yes, I can. So, right, brilliant. So it was Francesco's computer that had some problems, I fear.
Anyway, in fact. Yeah.
Yes. In the interest of those that are attending, let's continue. I was saying that this webinar is absolutely topical considering what is happening around the world. I asked Professor Jarvis before we started the webinar when the Genesis Manifesto was produced. I was thinking perhaps in the wake of Brexit, considering that some people in the UK advocated for the UK rejoining the customs union. Here we have Francesco. Okay, you're back. Can you hear us and see us, Francesco?
I can hear you and see you. I thought it was your problem, but in reality, it was my problem. Sorry about it.
No problem at all. No problem at all. I was just giving a few remarks on the Genesis Manifesto and its inception. But let me give the floor to you, Francesco, and because you can definitely better than me explain the meaning of this manifesto and what it means, especially for micro, small, and medium enterprises, which represent the backbone of many economies around the world, including my native Italy's.
Sure. Thank you very much indeed, Federico, for giving us such an opportunity once again. This is just wonderful to be here today with you and Robin. Robin is a very good friend of mine and a great colleague. He has been professor of accounting at Brunel University of London, Brunel Business School since 2010, and special advisor to the European Federation of Accountants and Auditors. Robin is non-exec director of Registry Trust and is chair of their Audit and Risk Committee. In the summer 2024, Robin edited and contributed to the Genesis Initiative Manifesto, board member and represents over 100 trade bodies. Now, to get back to your question, Federico, I think to summarize the Genesis initiative, I can tell you that this is a kind of effort to boost trade in goods and services between UK's micro and small businesses and the EU, representing over, as I said earlier on, 100 UK trade bodies, and we're talking about businesses with fewer 10 employees. This initiative emphasizes the EU's continued importance as a key trading partner. So despite the fact that the UK's exited from the EU and shifted to what we know to be the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the trade has declined significantly as small enterprises. So Genesis highlights the need to address these challenges, particularly with the rollout of a new customs declaration services in 2024. So Robin, thank you very much indeed for joining us. So here's my question. We know that in 2024, you summer last year, to this manifesto that I would like everyone to read. And this manifesto highlights the significant challenge that UK micro and small businesses continue to face when trading to the UE, with the UE. So it is kind of amazing, or I'm kind of puzzled, because my understanding is that when the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was implemented, which came into force in 2021, was specifically designed to protect, and I would say both EU and UK interests in terms of fair competition, foster cooperation across a broad range of sectors, from goods, services to digital trade, you name it, transport, and even judicial matters. However, we know that it does not replicate in depth. I think we would agree on these, the integration that already existed in the UK when the UK was a member state. But we also know that it is a deal that is a kind of free trade deal that is, I would say, fair in many respects, and it goes beyond any other deals that you can think about it. So I wonder, given this ambitious framework to replace the agreement that we had before the Brexit, why are small UK firms still struggling to engage the UK market?
Yes, thank you, Francesco. That I think the evidence points to exactly what you're saying, that smaller companies are struggling in the relationships with trading activities with the EU. Now, I suspect, and I mean, there's evidence from work done at University College London, for instance, by the Institute of Directors, and it goes on, that there is clearly a decline. Now, which hasn't been made up since Brexit. So the question is why there is a decline in, and we haven't been able to get back with the help of the trade agreement. And I think, and it's a personal view, but I think there's a lot of evidence once again supporting that view, that in fact what politicians, what negotiators ignore is small businesses. So what they look at this stage, they're looking at large businesses. So the agreements and the backgrounds of people in the negotiations invariably come from a big business perspective. Not surprisingly, if you look at something like the Financial Times, how many times do you see references to small business issues? Very, very little. people tend to focus on, and politicians, when they get their copy of the FT, will be reading about large businesses, not about small businesses. However, as you quite rightly said, and as Federico said, that simply on any economic indicator, that small businesses represent majority of the UK economy and the European economy. It's very much mirrored the percentages and contributions. So for instance, 2/3 of employment, which is one of the main indicators of economic activity, are from these small SMEs. So 2/3 are the total working population in Europe. 2/3 of them are represented by SMEs. Obviously, the other figure that's thrown around is 99% point something or other are businesses are SMEs. But when you look even further down, that people tend to think of SMEs in one particular group. And I would argue that's inappropriate, because the needs of those SMEs vary depending upon their size. So, for instance, 1/3 of those people employed we're talking about actually come from micro entities, which are defined in Europe as entities that employ less than 9. Now, the problem is that when we're looking at legislation, when we're looking at issues such as regulations within Europe and so forth, this tends to be ignored, and we look at the large companies, and often the regulation is drip fed into the legislation, if you like, of large organizations. And so what's really happened in the EU factually is that all the evidence points that small companies in the UK are finding real problems with regard to issues in terms of the customs checks, additional paperwork, rules of origin requirements, sanitary, and a load of other checks. And the measures particularly disrupt small firms, which often lack the resources to simply navigate the increased bureaucracy. And I would argue that that has been not thought of within the background of those negotiations. And certainly if you look at the negotiations between, going back even further, of Brexit, between Lord Foote, representing the UK government, and Michel Barnier, who was the EU negotiator, I argue particularly Lord Foote was particularly underprepared. And I think that just doesn't come from me. That's, I think, a fair reflection of other commentaries as well. And that reflects, once again, not understanding or not reflecting the views of the small businesses. So I think, it's a real problem to small businesses, and that, I think, tends to be the reason. And you just have to therefore employ small business experts, if you like, or small business representatives that really understand what's going on.
That is clear. Getting back to the manifesto, points to a significant drop in trade between the UK and the EU. I mean, since 2020. And this is particularly affecting, once again, micro and small businesses. In the context of a broader global trade shocks that we are facing nowadays, with Mr. Trump and his trade war against everyone else, and the rising of these barriers, can you give us a clearer sense of scale of this decline? I mean, what it really means for small UK firms on the ground?
Well, I think the reality is that that small firms, in terms of exporting, importing, were mainly trading not with other parts of the world, and the US, they were trading within Europe. So that's the critical aspect, is they were and clearly want to, because if you like, it's very similar cultures, very similar standards, that in the when the EU was in the when the UK was in the EU, they were very influential in my view. I worked for the Commission for quite a long spell on their financial services user groups, and in fact I chaired it for about 2 or 3 years, and I could see certainly on the financial services side that the UK was very influential. So a lot of those standards that the EU have now really have either derived from an influence, or been influenced, if you like, by the UK, and therefore that there's that opportunity, and the culture and so forth on levels of hygiene, safety, and all these issues have tended to be leveled out because of the free trade before. Now, clearly things have changed, and you get into situations where you have to certificate a lot of this stuff, and it becomes problematic and bureaucratic, basically. So you've got things, and it's really the small businesses have suffered. When you look at the EU share of UK trade, for instance, it's gone down substantially during the time. It's gone down, it's reckoned an average value of 30. Small firms, particularly those with 6 or fewer employees, saw their average value of EU exports drop by 30%. And that's work done at University College London. So it's been quite dramatic in that sense. So there is a real problem that has to be addressed. And similarly, the looking at evidence from the directors, the Institute directors, once again, they support what I've just been saying.
Yep. I mean, from a practical point of view, I wonder what are the specific pain points for these businesses? I mean, one of the most significant, for example, challenges is highlighted by the new EU General Product Safety Regulation requirement for the UK business to have a designated point of contact. I mean, put it differently, a responsible economic operator within the EU. Now, for large firms, I think this is often a kind of formality, if I can say so. But for small businesses and sole traders, for example, it can be a serious barrier to market access. So my question is, how realistic is for these smaller firms to find and trust such representative abroad? And what risks do they face if they get it wrong, from a legal perspective, put in this way?
Yes, I think there's very good points. That one of the problems with small businesses, of course, is the fact that they haven't got the resources, as you quite rightly said. That is a very good observation, that really large companies don't have much problems because they're global. They've got offices in France, Italy, Belgium, and so forth. English, UK companies often, so they know the legislation and so forth. So the big question is, how do small businesses cope with those trading situations? And I think the evidence is that, in my view, you won't be surprised, but I have done research on this, is that often the accountants, so the SMEs accountants who are separate, they're often called small, medium-sized practices, will have contacts within Europe, and they would know they could find out what the tax rates are, what legislation, relevant legislation is, and regulations in terms of trading in, for instance, in Norway, what's the VAT levels, the sales tax levels, all these sort of things. So they're very much helped by the small business practices of accountants who provide an advisory service outside, not surprisingly, because if you think about it, that all small firms have to have an accountant to file their accounts. So they've got a relationship like that already. And if they're using small accountants, the small accounting practices actually have the same problems of how to cope with legislation and a load of other compliance issues, not just accounting issues. So for instance, HR employment law. I investigated some time ago. I noted that the Federation of Small Business in the UK, which is the main area or organisation, I should say, for small business, representing small business in the UK, said that the main source of advice on employment law for small companies are accountants, small practicing accountants. Well, it's not surprising, because small companies, when I decided to investigate it, it become apparent that small companies, for instance, would be using payroll services of the accountants. The accountants provide those payroll services, and inevitably the owners or the people within the SMP are going to ask questions about employees, like, for instance, about, let's say, women employees who become pregnant. What are my legal rights? What are her legal rights? Small businesses aren't going to find this out themselves necessarily. They want to go to other sources. So what's happened is that SMEs, or SMPs, I should say, these practicing accountants, actually have quite a bit of knowledge in respect to HR and employment law, which surprised me. And when I gave this paper in a European forum about this, the Commission became very interested, because what the Commission saw this is that they see that a lot of the legislation, which is actually pitched, the regulation is pitched, as I said before, at large firm level. If they're producing legislation, regulation at that level, how do they know that these small enterprises within Europe are actually taking this stuff on board? It's very complex. How do they know about it? And things like employment law details. We know there's a hell of a lot of details in employment law. How would they know? And there was a debate anyway that on some jurisdictions, member states in Europe, accountants wouldn't be allowed to participate in this way or give such advice. But in lots of others, that would be the case. It never went any further with the Commission, but I had at least 2 meetings with Commission people regarding that particular issue of HR and employment law. So there's, I think it's a and in fact, in Europe, and I think Europe's much more advanced than anywhere else, possibly other than Singapore, just for Frederico's case. It's really advanced in terms of the amount it does think about SMEs, but still not enough. So there's a term that's used commonly, and I was just reading the latest newsletter of SME United yesterday. SME United is an umbrella organisation representing SMEs throughout Europe, in Italy, all over Europe. So the organisations, SME organisations in Italy, Belgium, so forth, will inevitably be members of SME United. Very influential crowd, SME United. They're called a social partner of the European Commission. So any legislation or consultation will always go to the SME United before it's actually drafted and so forth. They'll be in the consultation process. And and they have come up with this term of thinking small first. So they're saying to the regulators, you should be thinking small first. And it's like block building. So you start looking at the very small companies. What is the appropriate regulation? Because we all recognize regulation is very important to be to make markets efficient, obviously it does tend to sometimes create bureaucracy and should be monitored, certainly. But in that sense, it makes it efficient, and that's the mantra, and to some extent it works in Europe. But it's problematic in the sense that it's not fully taken on, and certainly in the UK, it's a term that's not recognised at all, or in practice not operated on, in my view. I think we've lost Francesco.
Yes, we have lost him, but allow me to step in, Robin.
Yeah, sure.
I do. I absolutely agree with your remark about accountants. In fact, they are the gatekeepers, if you want. I wonder two things. Oh, Francesco, hi. We I was stepping in, Francesco, mentioning the role of
I just had to switch device because this is not working, for some reasons.
Not a problem. I allowed myself to step in with a remark about accountants, because from my perspective as an Italian, I see that they are indeed the gatekeepers. Accountants play a pivotal role in virtually anything that small and medium enterprises do, because they are the first entry point, if you want, for companies when they have questions about anything that relates to bureaucracy, etc. Now, I wonder, however, if, first of all, in the UK, there are subsidies or there are, in any case, issues pertaining the costs of accountants. Because one thing is to use accountants for what they statutorily have to do for a company. So finalizing financial statements, okay, they have to do it. Fair enough, you pay for their services. But maybe a small or a micro enterprise doesn't have the financial resources to ask questions about HR, as you mentioned earlier. And I wonder if there are any schemes for that. For instance, some accountants in the European Union specialize in EU grants, and usually their fees are an initial a retainer fee initially, but then they also charge a success fee in case they manage to obtain grants for those companies. And the second question that I had is whether AI is playing a role, if at all. As a lawyer, I do see AI indeed being used, sometimes in the wrong way, by my clients that generate agreements and other legal documents that are more often rather than not very poorly drafted and end up in disasters, and then have to step in and fix the mess that they generated. But still, there will be for sure a trend where 20 years ago it was Google replacing lawyers. Now it is AI replacing lawyers. And I wonder whether this is true also for accountants, and generally speaking, whether this is true and it is a useful tool for micro and small medium enterprises to step up and go to Europe and trade with the EU bloc.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think going back to the micro, starting off with the micro aspects about having enough resources to pay for advice, I think it is a problem. And certainly in the UK, what they try to, as an alternative, have tried to set up various government have various bodies where they can these micros can seek advice. So for instance, there was something called Business Link in the UK for a number of years, which a lot of people said worked very effectively. For some reason or other, which I can't remember the details, it was dropped by government, and there is a vacuum, I think, at the moment. But on the other hand, is what's quite funny from the accounting perspective, because I had 10 years of working as a director of small business for ACCA, one of the accounting firms or umbrella groups. We had problems in the sense of when our accountants, when our members started giving advice, advisory capacity outside compliance, that they didn't talk and didn't know how to charge people for it. And also the small businesses assumed that that was free because they're getting paid, they're paying for the compliance side, and it was never clearly differentiated. So it's a problem for accountants, and as well as as well as the SMEs, I suppose, and the smaller ones, as you quite rightly said, there is a problem. Now, getting back to electronic digitalization and particularly AI, I'm very interested in AI. I've been doing a series of interviews and where it's being used by accountants. And I'm not overly convinced at the moment of the extent it's being used, but I think that it could be the answer to a lot of issues. I mean, for instance, if you go to auditing, when companies audited, accountants audited a firm, they would look at a sample of the transactions, the documentation relating to just a sample. The sample was based on sort of scientific methods of saying, if you took, let's say, 20% of the sample, it'd reflect the whole of the population. In fact, AI, which is being used in auditing now, you take the whole lot. So you don't take any samples anymore, you take in the whole lot, because it's very easy and cheap to do so. So it's having quite a dramatic effect, but I'm not sure in terms of advisory services how much is being used at the moment. But I think there's a very good opportunity to do just that. And I think this overall, I think it's the Commission wrote or researched a situation of digitalization, a report in, I think it's 2022, which actually identified small businesses and micros in need of helping them provide digitalization services, of updating their training, all this sort of stuff, and actually governments financing that. And I think there's a need, if you like, of developing these services, but also to support them financially in terms of training schemes and the like. So I hope that answers some of your words. It's not
Absolutely.
an answer anyway, but it's a very interesting issue, I think.
Thank you very much, Robin. Back to you, Francesco.
Thank you, Federico. Mentioning digitalization, electronic invoicing has been credited with boosting revenues. And this started from my conversation with you that I had with you, Robin, yesterday in Italy, that if I'm not wrong, Italy saw an increase because of this electronic invoicing of 6 billion after introducing it in 2019. So what's your take on the role of e-invoicing in improving tax compliance and transparency? And how are other countries within Europe or the UK responding to this?
Well, some time ago, a few years ago now, that the EU, once again, great initiative, was looking at introducing e-invoicing into the European Union, and when the UK were involved as well. And I was representing what the accounting body EFAA, which is the European Federation of Accountants and Auditors, in a number of these meetings. They're very large meetings, you can imagine, because there's lots of stakeholders who are very interested in it. And in Europe, since Brexit and so forth, they've moved very much ahead and have a directive that all mandatory, that is, that all EU member states have to introduce EU invoicing. It initially started, I understand, with public sector. So if I was working for the public sector, if I was an SME, for instance, doing gardening work or something such as that for a local authority, I would have to be invoiced, and the invoice would be based on electronic invoicing. The evidence of electronic invoicing is it reduces costs substantially. It reduces, very importantly, late payment. And so there's a number of countries within the number of member states within Europe who have actually introduced it already. There's a number that haven't still in the process of doing so. So, for instance, as I said to you, in terms of Italy, for instance, Italy saved, I think, about 6 billion, the figure I've seen, because of the introduction of, I can't quite see the reference at the moment, because of e-invoicing. Now, one of the problems, I think, with a lot of introducing some of these really effective ways of trading is sort of, if you like, small businesses, and just generally, that businesses are very hesitant with change. They don't like change. So introducing something like e-invoicing, it was seen as a real problem, especially to SMEs. And 2 weeks ago, I was in Brussels and I was listening to a Cypriot, actually a Cypriot accountant who's got a practice in Nicosia. And Cyprus have already introduced e-invoicing. And basically, he said that 2 years ago, when it was introduced, there was a lot of pressure by the SMEs against it and by the small practitioner accountants. However, 2 years on, because it's mandatory, it's been brilliant. They've all accepted it. It's much easier. The late payment levels have decreased substantially, and businesses really profited from e-invoicing. And that's, I think, a very good example of how digitalization can actually be introduced and be very effective at cost cutting and very much helping small businesses in terms of the issues of late payment. Late payments are just a complete nightmare on cash flow situations for small businesses.
Yeah. Yeah. And getting back to the manifesto, I mean, the manifesto, when you read the manifesto proposes the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly as a way forward. So what role could it realistically play?
Yeah, it's very interesting, because only last week I was asked by Genesis has a European representative, actually lives in Paris, a person called David Doyle. And he's actually, I didn't know that there's an EU, well, I vaguely knew, there was a UK-EU Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, all right? I didn't really know much about it. And he was going on to me and saying, we just have to get involved. That our Prime Minister on the 12th of December 2024 actually appointed 3 parliamentarians to participate in this particular partnership. And of course, they are, the 3 that I've seen here don't have a background necessarily in business at all. Also that I understand there's the chairman is Mr. Sandro Gozzi, who's from France. There's a vice chair from Hungary and another vice chair from Finland on the European side. Now, presumably in the near future, this assembly will be involved in talking about EU trading levels. Now, once again, it comes back to the very first points I was making earlier, that these people, I would argue, are very unlikely to know anything about or much about small businesses. So therefore, my colleague in Brussels has asked me to do some research on these 3 English people and to potentially write a paper for them pointing out these issues. So in my view, it's a very, very important partnership assembly that, but we have to get involved in it. We can't just let people negotiate things at the parliamentary level. We need to participate and give information to these people, to provide them with relevant information about how business, and particularly small business, is working, and particularly to these barriers that we're experiencing with trading in Europe. Both ways, of course. That it's not just the UK trading with small business trading with the EU. It's the EU people trading with us. It's quite a substantial amount of imports we have from the EU, as you could possibly imagine, and they're facing those types of barriers as well. It's just unhealthy, and particularly, as Federico said in the very beginning, when you start looking at tariffs and issues that the United States are bringing in, we have to look, in my view, much more closer to those established relationships in Europe, particularly for the SME. So it's very important to lower those levels of problems with bureaucracy and so forth.
Yeah. Getting back to Europe and the trade with the UK in terms of SMEs, micro, including micro businesses, and in relation to the environment. Now, Europe is lagging behind when compared to the US. We know this, and China in terms of many things like productivity, adoption of innovation, and so forth. But when it comes to environment, it looks like it's a kind of role model for the world. And it's like kind of leading the way, showing the way for many businesses, including the UK businesses. However, climate change and sustainability regulations are becoming, I think, more demanding. Yep. But for many small businesses, navigating this information, this bureaucracy, these regulations is a real challenge. So what support or tools exist to help them to stay compliant and competitive, given that Europe is incredibly demanding when it comes to regulations in terms of climate and environmental sustainability?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important issue that, in my view, I think there's once again strong evidence supporting it, that basically we're talking about, from a business angle, I suppose we're talking about investors wanting to invest in companies that are conscious and operating a green agenda. There's something called, run by the UN Massive, called the Principles of Responsible Investment, where investors, large investing companies, pension funds, etc., are signing up to 7, I think it is, 7 issues related to climate change, i.e. they, in effect, they should be investing only in those companies that are conscious and reporting. On the other hand, from the accounting profession, or from disclosure, I should say, of those companies, what they're doing, there's the EU, more than any other, if you like, trading area, have been very active in terms of developing these disclosure requirements. So each company in Europe has to disclose what their carbon emissions are, etc., with their accounting information every year. It's under something called the CSRD. So that's a very, very important, so that these investors can then see, of course, are these companies doing what they're saying, if you like, in terms of green energy and so forth. So you've got companies like BP, for instance, British Petroleum. Investors are very sensitive at the moment to investing in BP because of they have ditched to some extent some of their green objectives recently. And you can monitor that by simply seeing what's in their annual reports on disclosures of emissions, etc., which of course also have to be audited. So you have to have assurance that what they're saying is correct, which is quite a problem in itself, actually, to do that. But that's the process. Now, as I said, we're really Europe has very much advanced more than the UK's outside it, and they're applying what's called international financial reporting standards with these climate change issues bound up. But the real problem from SME angle, which we've been involved in, is the problem that these large companies who are reporting about information on emissions are going to be asking in their supply chain, companies in their supply chain, for information about their emissions so they can embody within their disclosure. The problem is you go down to the very small companies who are in that supply chain and being asked in detail, it's going to cost a fortune. It's very difficult. It's going to be a massive burden. We agree with the whole process about green reporting and everything else, but it's problematic. So what the Commission have been, and with the accounting profession and other stakeholders have been involved in, is developing what they call voluntary SME standards. Now, these voluntary SME standards are on climate change, and the argument is that small businesses voluntarily will use them. But the issue is, will large companies still say, we will forget about these voluntary standards, we want this information? So there is a group of people, and in particular, I've got in front of me the SME United newsletter, for this came out yesterday, and it talks about VSME, the voluntary SME, addressing the trickle-down effect without unnecessary burdens for SMEs. And it's what they want to happen, and I've been listening to this, is they want a cap. So when large companies ask for information about climate change and about emissions, etc., they will have a cap, and the cap is the standard SME, the voluntary SME standard. So they won't have to go above that. So they should be, if you like, working towards developing these standards, these small companies, to satisfy the supply chain issues. Now, what's also happened, because when we were talking before, Francesco, is that, of course, with all this, particularly the US being very, I don't know, anti-green, I was told yesterday by, I think it's yesterday, yeah, it was yesterday actually, by an old friend I hadn't seen for a long time, and his son works at Berkeley University in the States, and he works on green issues, okay, but he's not allowed to use the word green in any of the papers he produces. Not allowed to use the term green. I mean, I don't know how mandatory this is, but that's what he's telling me. So because of that, I think it's inevitably had an effect on and the lobby, of course, in Europe. And what's happened in Europe is that there's been an omnibus, which came out in February 2025. It's called Omnibus 3, I think it is, where what the Commission and the Parliament has done is, instead of asking or demanding that companies in the first stage of this process about disclosing emissions, etc., that originally it was companies employing over 500 would be the first companies having to do this. What they've done now is extended it and said, well, not extended it, actually saying, no, it's going to be companies that employ over 1,000. Mm-hmm. They've also reduced the timing, well, increased the timing rather than reduced it when this is about, which is a bit disappointing. But I suppose we all understand, the political problems. And overall, I think it was a part of this omnibus thing, which was to try to reduce bureaucracy in general, but in particular on this CSRD, these CSRD issues, which I think is a very important issue. And and I think there's a lot. It says here in the SME United newsletter, what they want is voluntary standard for SMEs must be the cap in the value chain and be as simple as possible. And no assurance, no auditing should be asked on SMEs.
Yep.
So yeah, I think it's a very important issue, and I think it's something worth keeping an eye on.
Sure.
A lot of academic opportunities here to do research, in my view, as well.
Yeah. And speaking about academic research and opportunities in academia, I mean, the manifesto ends on a somewhat hopeful note regarding UK alignment with EU standards and participation in projects such as Horizon Europe.
Yeah.
So, for example, next week, I think at Brunel University of London, we're going to have a matching event with academics and showing opportunities regarding relation to Horizon Europe. And, these projects must involve SMEs, firms in general. So could this be the start of a more constructive relationship?
Yes, I think everything I've read tends to agree exactly what you're suggesting. It is very important to the UK that we're party to this Horizon. In fact, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology and UK Research Innovation has had a meeting, as I understand it, in March, with the objectives of recognising that the UK success in Horizon, about the amount of money universities have got. And it's only been the last year, of course, when we joined the Horizon programme again, after exiting the EU. So I just think it's just so important that we know we've got some very good academics in the UK who can actually contribute substantially from the innovation and technology to Europe and European companies and so forth. So yeah, I think Horizon is if you like, has been very influential. And when UK policymakers see what's happened with Horizon, I think there'd be even a bigger push for us to get back into Europe.
Mm-hmm. So this is my final question. What's your message to UK policymakers, not to EU, to UK policymakers, the main message, given that it looks like it doesn't matter where we are, and we know that SMEs are the backbone of our economies, but the policymakers they don't get it, how important they are, and they should be part of a continuing discussion, dialogue, while making their policy implementation. So what is your main message to UK policymakers?
Well, I think I think it's to recognise the importance of EU trade at the SME issue, because it's very, very important. To recognise that the size issue is a very important issue. That in the SME world, you've got a situation of which defined, I use the European definitions of a medium-sized company is from 50 to 249 employees, looking at employee definition. Small is from 10 to 50, and micro is from under 9 employees. Now, if you start thinking about we know about these sizes, they're very, very different. So it's not only just recognizing SMEs, the importance of them, and protecting them and supporting them in their trade, but it's also actually recognizing the needs of these smaller ones. Also, I think a lot more work, and perhaps AI is going to be helpful to us to get the evidence on this, is on sectors. It's worth looking at sectors, in my view, because they're different. You can look from the SME angle, they're different, and they have certain problems which others may not have. And, you know, that, I mean, for instance, financial services will have a very different, if I employed, let's say, 9 people, and I'm a micro company, and I've got a financial services company, it's very different from a small manufacturing firm producing fasteners and metal items for the market and so forth, which is part of. I was listening the other day to a small company employing, they call it micro company, that's producing for car parts, which were coming from the Europe, and they were doing some particular aspect to them to be passed on, because they were a specialist group, passed on to the assembly line or whatever, which was somewhere else. And I think we forget as well the supply chains, the value chains now as well. So it's looking at value chains, SMEs, the size of the SMEs and their needs. And their needs really relate to, in my view, to things like access to finance, thinking about supporting productivity, thinking as well about apprenticeships and training, and about research and development from universities and so forth. So those, I think, are the big issues. And arguably, if you really put me in a difficult position, I would find evidence to support what I just said.
Thank you so much, Robin. Federico.
Brilliant. There would be so much more to discuss. When you, Francesco, mentioned the role of the European Union in fostering environmental practices and standards, I thought about my beloved Vietnam, where I spend quite a lot of my time, and how important the EU's initiatives have been for Vietnam's green transition out of any rhetoric. I mean, forget about greenwashing, but Vietnam desperately needs those standards. And the same could be told about the GDPR and even AI regulations, even though I tend to be slightly more skeptical about regulating something that we don't fully understand at this stage. But for instance, Vietnam's proposed AI regulation is more or less based on the AI Act of the EU. So there's a lot of talk. I would conclude on a positive note, which is, despite all the negativity that we breathe in Europe as a continent, so I believe also in the UK, not just in the EU, we do have pretty remarkable standards and practices that could be adopted worldwide, and we could definitely become a beacon of, if you want, for lack of a better term, of civilization and rule of law, in spite of what happens worldwide. And we should probably not be attracted by other systems that do not uphold these standards and rule of law. On this note, I thank you very, very much. I thank the participants for having joined us. You will be able to rewatch or watch for the first time, if it is the first time that you did watch this video, on YouTube, on our channel, the Antevorta Foundation channel on YouTube. Stay tuned. It's Easter soon, so we will probably take slightly more than in the past in uploading this video on YouTube. Stay tuned. Probably next week the video will be online. Check our social media channels, our website, antevortafoundation.com, and our YouTube page if you want to watch this and previous videos. I really look forward to another round with Robin, because it's been absolutely fascinating, and 1 hour was definitely not enough. Francesco, thank you very, very much for your unwavering support to our foundation. For all of you, for our viewers, do read Francesco's contributions on antevortafoundation.com. They are really insightful. I learn a lot reading from him. Again, thank you. Happy Easter to those that celebrate. And thank you again. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.